Welcome to Author Talkback at Common Word. I'm Arlen Friesenepp, the director of our nationwide bookstore and resource center. We're very pleased to have Jesse Nicol here with us, faculty member of Columbia Bible College in the Abbotsford, BC, where he teaches in the Biblical Studies program. He is the author of the new book, A Revolutionary Jesus, Violence and Peacemaking in the Kingdom of God. Welcome. And
Thank you so much.
congratulations on the completion of this book.
Thank you.
I am drawn to your book's title and the use of the provocative word revolutionary. Maybe we can start there. What might you mean by a revolutionary Jesus?
Yeah, great question. First of all, I want to say thanks so much, Arlen, for having me here. It's exciting to get this chance to talk about something that I care very deeply about, and yeah, just to share some of that with your audience. So thanks for the invitation. On that title, uh, as I'm sure you're aware, authors don't always get to choose their titles. So this title was, in fact, a suggestion of the publisher. So I do want to say that. But that being said, I do think that revolutionary Jesus fits with a key part of the message that I hope the book communicates, which is that the ways by which Jesus went about his mission were to many of his contemporaries surprising and unexpected, to the point that I think they could be called revolutionary. And then there's another aspect to the title in that it alludes to, this is a bit more particular to the content of the book, but there's a contrast that I try to point out between Jesus and those of his contemporaries who were more drawn to nationalistic revolutionary activity. And without going really into the weeds here, I think that properly understanding that contrast is a part of what enables us to see more clearly just what was distinctive about Jesus's ministry.
In the Anabaptist theological tradition within which you write, peacemaking, as you described, as was embodied, taught, and lived by Jesus, uh, is understood to be central to the Christian faith. Um, and you talk about the contrast between the position and posture of Jesus and some of his contemporaries.
Mm-hmm.
How does your book contribute to this understanding of Jesus as peacemaker?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. This is great because it really this is at heart what led me to want to write the book in the first place. So it's great to have the chance to talk about this. Um, my hope is that this book contributes to an understanding of Jesus-centered peacemaking, by demonstrating that peace. And I do want to clarify here that that term peace, I'm focusing particular, I'm writing about what I kind of refer to as shalom peace. That is to say, peace that is about a lot more than just not fighting, right? This is peace that is the result of reconciliation, of restoration, of healing, of flourishing. Um, this is peace that is, most importantly of all, it's definitive of God's kingdom. And this shalom peace is not incidental to Jesus's life and ministry, but is in fact at its very heart. Um, so I understand Jesus's ministry to be focused on this idea of the kingdom of God. So Jesus is announcing that everything that God had promised that God would one day do, so bring about this restoration and healing and justice and freedom from oppression, um, raising up the downtrodden and bringing down the wicked, all of that great stuff that is in Mary's song. He's announcing that all of this is about to take place. And he's not just announcing it, but he's actually inaugurating this reality that Jesus is doing these things himself. And so, as Jesus is going about this work of proclaiming and inaugurating God's reign, he is steadfastly refusing to use violence to do so. Violence, it seems quite clear for Jesus, violence is not going to be used to accomplish the work of the kingdom. And then, hand in hand with that rejection of violence, comes an emphasis upon this shalom peace. So, the reality that Jesus is inaugurating is characterized by shalom, and therefore his work results in shalom. And he calls those who would enter the kingdom to do likewise, to live lives that are characterized by this shalom and to be peace, to be shalom makers. So, all of this is to say that this rejection of violence and the pursuit of peace, of shalom, isn't just as I think it's sometimes being viewed. It's not just an ethical add-on to Jesus's, quote unquote, real work of bringing salvation, but it is inextricably bound up with the heart of Jesus's work. Um, the kingdom of God is the kingdom of shalom. Violence is antithetical to shalom. And therefore, violence can have nothing to do with the kingdom or with its work or with those who belong to it, who all of this is instead to be characterized by peace.
You write as a biblical scholar, and you spend the heart of the book describing this peacemaking of Jesus in the context of his day, like you said, in contrast with the violent milieu of the Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
And also, while the religious community, his contemporaries, longed for a violent uprising that would destroy the occupation. Um, Bringing this to today and our own setting or your own setting, there is perhaps a contrast. You write in the preface that you compose the book as a white heterosexual cisgender educated middle class male from Western Canada with no direct experience with extreme violence. So how is Jesus's first century peacemaking as um, alternative to the violence of his day applicable to you or your and many of our contemporary contexts? Or maybe said a different way, how do you understand the kingdom of God, the reign of God for today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, yeah. So I think the first thing I'd want to say to that is the reason that I laid out those that long list of identity descriptors in the preface um, is to kind of act as a guardrail to try to prevent this conversation from becoming trapped in the realm of theory and thought, right? Like you say, my training is as a biblical scholar and in the academy, um, and I feel very deeply that I don't want this conversation to stay there, right? None of this matters if it's not about how we actually live our embodied lives as followers of Jesus engaged in the world around us. Um, and every time I speak on this topic, I'm conscious of precisely the tension that you identified in your question. This tension that results from this. I mean, I can't do anything about it. This undeniable fact that and I want to say, thanks be to God, I do not speak from firsthand experience of oppressive violence. Um, and that's a fact. And so, does that mean that I should just stay silent and stick to my lane? Well, some would probably say, yeah, it does. Let other people who have hands-on experience of it talk about this. Well, there may be some justification for that. But on the other hand, the more that I read the Gospels and the more that I listen to Jesus and watch him act, the more I consider the way that Jesus's first followers embodied their own understanding of who Jesus was calling them to be and how they were to live that out. Um, I simply can't deny that I am just more and more convinced that no matter where I come from or what my story is, the call to pursue and to be makers of peace is too central. It's too important for me to keep quiet about. Um, so speaking of myself and others in similar socio-political circumstances in Canada, in the US, um, we might not live under oppressive foreign imperial powers, but I do think that we live in a world in which violence and hostility is rampant. I mean, it's all around us. Um, and so Jesus's peacemaking is still very much so relevant to us. Um, two ways in which I maybe would want to highlight this, though there could be many more. First of all, I think we need to refuse to accept the belief which is widely held in our world. It's so widely held as it's almost unquestioned. It's just assumed, which is that violence, if it's used properly, can be a tool for good.
Mm.
We need to resist that myth, especially the idea that it can be used for good that is connected to the going forth of God's kingdom. Um, I believe that we, as followers of Jesus, need to commit ourselves to working for justice and working for the protection of the vulnerable, using means that resonate with the character of the kingdom that we are working towards. And then the second way I would see this as resonating with our context is we need to consider how Jesus's act of making peace is formative for the church itself. Um, if we want to be a peacemaking people, here I'm drawing on Nelson Crable's book, Stuck Together,
Mhm.
and he makes reference there to David Fitch's work as well. And both of them make this point pretty powerfully that if we want to be a peacemaking people, we need to be a people at peace,
Mm.
a people who are at peace with one another. And the church is far too often, a place of hostility and division. And, we snipe at one another across our denominational divides. And if anything, treat each other with more hostility than we do with, quote unquote, outsiders. And when we do that, we betray Jesus's work. Um, Paul in Ephesians 2 writes about Jesus making peace through the cross, by which he destroyed the hostility that once existed between us, taking what was divided and reconciling us to one another through our being reconciled to God. That too is shalom making. That's peacemaking. It starts with our relationships to one another. And so I would see both of those as pretty critical ways in which this message of peace is, of absolute relevance for our lives as Jesus followers today.
Thank you. Um, at the end of the book, you close with a chapter on discipleship
Mm-hmm.
and three calls to action: obedience, imitation, and participation in the way of Christ. I'm just wondering if you could describe those three postures.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Um, yeah, so just like you said, when I look at what the authors of the New Testament then have to say about what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, I see these three kind of frameworks being articulated there, and this is really my attempt to help us to do what I was talking about in that last question, which is move this from the realm up here, right, just out into actually, okay, how do we embody this? So the first word I use or focus on is obedience. So I think this one in some ways is the easiest. Jesus is clearly not the easiest in practice, but in kind of understanding. Jesus is clearly a great teacher. And much of his teaching is focused on what it looks like to live within the kingdom that he's proclaiming and inaugurating. Um, maybe the quintessential expression of that is the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel. And in the closing words of the sermon, Jesus makes it clear that he doesn't just want us to, listen to what he said and walk away saying, "Man, that was some really good teaching, right? That guy's pretty good, right?" But that we are actually to do what he says. It's that well-known parable, right? The wise one is the one who builds his house on the firm land, actually puts into practice what Jesus says. So discipleship is clearly about following Jesus's teaching. The second, imitation. Um, it might be surprising for some to learn that outside of the Gospels in the New Testament, we find only a few direct references to Jesus's teaching itself. But we find an abundance of references to Jesus's example. Um, so when the earliest leaders and teachers of the church, folks like Peter and James and Paul and John, when they're writing to these various communities of believers about how they ought to put their faith into practice, they're routinely pointing to Jesus's own life. And more often than not, they're holding up Jesus's conduct as he goes to the cross as the kind of the paradigmatic example to be imitated. So Jesus himself says this kind of thing. If we think, for example, of like Mark 8:34, pretty well-known verse, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. This is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. And that's then picked up in pretty well-known texts like Philippians chapter 2, 6-11, and Hebrews chapter 12, 1-3. Look at Jesus and put into practice the example you see there. That's at the heart of discipleship. And then lastly, and this one is maybe the least familiar, I think it's important to emphasize that discipleship is about participation. Um, the Gospels tell us that Jesus not only called his disciples, he didn't just say, "Oh, come tag along and watch what I do and listen to what I say." There are these, more than one point where he's actually sending them out to share in his work and equipping them to do that. And then, of course, that's picked up on and transformed in Acts with the pouring out of the Spirit. This great act of empowerment of Jesus's followers to carry on the work of the kingdom that Jesus has begun. So the idea I see here is that Jesus begins the work of inaugurating God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. Um, and then in this powerful yet mysterious way, Jesus wins its climactic victory through the cross and his resurrection. And yet the work isn't fully complete in a sense because Jesus summons us, his body on earth, the church, to carry on this mission of announcing and embodying this reality of God's reign. And if I can say one last comment on this, I think what's key to all of that for me is that I think that shalom, peace, is central to all three components of discipleship. So Jesus commands us to be peacemakers. Jesus himself exemplifies peacemaking as he goes to the cross. And then we are called to participate in the work of the kingdom, which is the work of the kingdom of shalom, peace, and to use the same sort of means that Jesus himself did in doing that work.
How would you assess maybe the current Mennonite church in North America? Well, or in your local context or wider,
Hmm.
however you'd like to say it. How strong is this peacemaking theology? You've written
Yeah.
within the church for the church.
Mm-hmm.
Um, um, would you have an assessment for us? Like, did you write the book for the person in the pew?
Yeah.
Like we said, it's a scholarly book,
Right.
but it's an accessible book, and it's a message clearly from how you described it as for everyone.
Yeah.
Um, so, did you write it for us, or to
Yeah.
to whom were you thinking you were writing your book?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, it really makes me happy to hear you say that word accessible. I certainly hope that is the experience that people have if they pick it up and read it. Because, yeah, again, exactly like you say, my hope is that this would be for all Christians who want to think more deeply about the significance of peace to the life of following Jesus. Um, Now, certainly something I've been told by my editor and by others is, every author thinks that their book is for everybody, and every author deludes themselves into thinking that, right? So, more probably realistically, the book is most readable by folks who have a little bit a foundation of knowledge about the New Testament, and more specifically about the first century Jewish world of Jesus and his first followers. So, um, I think it would be a great resource for pastors or any others who are teaching or leading Christian communities, whether in the church or in parachurch ministry, and who want to think a bit more about how is our work, the work that we are called into, to be centered in and focused upon this idea of peacemaking, as is understood through Jesus. Um, to the other part of the question about the Mennonite church, I mean, I don't feel that I'm in a position to assess the Mennonite church across all of North America by any means.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I mean the vast majority of my experience has been limited to my little pocket of the Mennonite world here in the lower mainland of British Columbia. But setting that aside, I would say that the answer to the question, did I write it for the people I go to church with and the students I teach and the folks in our larger MCBC um, family of churches? I mean, the answer would be, and even more widely, of course, MC Canada, the answer would be an emphatic yes to that. Um, there's two stories that kind of stuck out in my mind when I was thinking about this question. Um, so the first one, I grew up attending a Mennonite church, and many of the older folks in the church, many of whom first planted that church, were first generation immigrants that came to Canada either directly or indirectly as a result of violence in Europe of the 1930s and the 1940s. Um, and growing up, as I got older and became more aware of that and of Anabaptist theology, I always assumed that all of them must kind of wholeheartedly embrace pacifism because of all that they themselves had suffered and lost because of the violence of warfare and political unrest. But then in 2004, which was this is shortly after the US had invaded Iraq, I found myself in a conversation with one of these people. And to my shock, she was lauding President Bush. This was, I remember her saying, this is a good Christian man, and praising his efforts to fight against these evil terrorists, right? And that conversation sticks in my mind as a moment of kind of eye opening to this reality that even in my congregation, where we were regularly praying for peace in the world and speaking of God's peace in our worship, like plenty of my sisters and brothers are thinking differently when it actually comes to action on the ground in the real world, or I should real world, right? And then the second story is so here at Columbia Bible College, where I teach, about 35% of our students are connected with Mennonite churches. Most of those are MB churches, some of them are MCBC. And again, my assumption was that those students would have a basic awareness of the fact that a commitment to peacemaking and nonviolence was a significant component of an Anabaptist understanding of following Jesus. And then I'm a few years into teaching here, and I'm in a class, and we're focused on Jesus's action in the temple. And I'm talking about how I don't think that this justifies a Christian use of violence. And I can still picture the look on one student's face. This student, I knew him a little bit. I knew him enough to know that he came from a Mennonite background. And I'm talking about this, and he puts up his hand, and in just like shock and disbelief, he says, "Wait, like, are you saying that you don't think violence is ever okay for Christians?" Like, just cannot believe that this is what I seem to be suggesting by what I'm saying. And this is another moment of eye opening for me. So, I mean, I don't tell those stories in any way to look down on those folks. I tell them as examples to demonstrate this undeniable reality that to commit to nonviolence is deeply countercultural in our world and difficult to embrace fully. Um, yeah, so I very much wrote this book for the Mennonite Church. There are numerous institutions and groups of people that I can think of that are working uh, in powerful and profound ways for the shalom peace of God's reign in North America. Um, but I think that whether our peacemaking theology is strong or weak, whether we're more or less committed to pacifism or nonviolent peacemaking than we once may have been, um, my hope is that wherever we're at on this spectrum, this book is going to serve to renew a passion and commitment to those sorts of things in our communities.
It's been wonderful, Jesse, for to have this conversation. Thank you so much for it. I do also hope that a revolutionary Jesus will inspire, equip, and embolden us in ways of Christ's peace and shalom. Um, Congratulations again on the release of the book, and thank you for this conversation. A Revolutionary Jesus is available to buy or borrow from your local bookstore, or to buy or borrow from Common Word, commonword.ca. Thank you so much for watching.
Thanks, Arlen. I really appreciate this chance. It was good to talk to you.
Great. Thank you. We'll see you.
Okay, bye.